EY economists warn of a 1.5 percentage point drop in 2025, $375 billion loss in America, potentially triggering recessionary pressures due to tariffs, war between Canada and USA, which is actually horrific to look at. Further, countless sectors will be affected, leading to hyperinflation. The US-Canada-Mexico tariff war represents a crisis of both economics and epistemology, a clash between data-driven policymaking and populist conviction. While retaliatory measures have indeed created pressure points, true American pushback remains embryonic, constrained by electoral calculations and bureaucratic inertia. The path forward demands multilateral creativity, perhaps through hybrid solutions that address legitimate security concerns without sacrificing integrated prosperity. As supply chain tremors intensify, all three nations confront a shared reality. In globalized economics, there are no unilateral solutions, only varying degrees of mutual destruction. The coming months will test whether political leadership can evolve faster than economic damage accumulates. The recent escalation of trade tensions between the United States, Canada, and Mexico has thrust North America into an economic showdown with far-reaching consequences. On February 1, 2025, the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs of 25% on most imports from Canada and Mexico, with a reduced 10% rate on Canadian oil, and an additional 10% levy on Chinese goods. These measures, justified as tools to combat illegal immigration and drug trafficking, have triggered immediate retaliation from Canada and threats of countermeasures from Mexico. The situation now presents a complex web of economic risks, diplomatic friction, and policy contradictions that demand rigorous analysis from multiple angles. The anatomy of escalation. President Trump's decision to invoke the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to bypass USMCA trade agreement restrictions marks a significant departure from traditional trade policy. By framing immigration and drug flows as national security emergencies, the administration circumvented normal legislative channels. The tariffs apply to over $475 billion in Mexican imports and $322 billion in Canadian goods annually, with specific carve-outs for Canadian energy exports reflecting strategic dependency. The U.S. imports 8.47 million barrels per day of Canadian crude, accounting for 60% of its total oil imports. This dichotomy reveals a tension between protectionist rhetoric and practical energy needs. Canada's retaliatory measures, 25% tariffs on $155 billion worth of U.S. goods, were strategically calibrated to maximize political impact. Targeting politically sensitive sectors like Wisconsin dairy, Michigan automobiles, and Kentucky bourbon, the measures aim to pressure key congressional districts. Prime Minister Trudeau's public encouragement for Canadians to boycott American products adds a psychological dimension to the economic conflict, potentially costing U.S. tourism and retail sectors billions. Mexico's response remains less defined, but reportedly includes non-tariff barriers and supply chain diversification efforts, leveraging its position as America's largest trading partner with $1.5 trillion in annual bilateral trade. Economic contagion risks. The immediate financial impacts are stark. Cornell University projections suggest Canadian GDP could contract by 3.6% under sustained tariffs, with Mexico facing a 2% decline. For context, the 2018 to 2019 U.S.-China trade war reduced global GDP by 0.5%. This North American confrontation could double that damage given tighter regional integration. Supply chain analyses show 40% of U.S. manufactured goods contain Canadian components, while 25% of Mexican exports to the U.S. are intermediate goods used in American factories. Disruptions could idle production lines within weeks. Consumer price impacts are already materializing. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates the tariffs will add 0.8 to 1.2% to inflation in 2025, potentially pushing annual rates to 4%, double the Federal Reserve's target. Specific sectors face acute pressure. Automotive. A typical $35,000 vehicle containing 30% Canadian parts would see costs rise $2,625. Construction. Canadian lumber tariffs could add $9,000 to the price of a new home agriculture. Mexican avocado prices have spiked 18% since the announcement labor markets face asymmetric risks. While Trump claims tariffs will create manufacturing jobs, Moody's Analytics predicts net losses of 250,000 U.S. positions by Q4 2025, 75,000 in auto sectors, 30,000 in aerospace, and 15,000 in brewing. Canada anticipates 100,000 job losses, concentrated in Quebec's aluminum industry and Ontario's auto parts sector. Mexico's vulnerable informal economy, 56% of its workforce, faces existential threats if tariffs persist beyond 6 months. Strategic miscalculations. The administration's rationale for tariffs contains critical inconsistencies. While citing fentanyl as justification, DEA data shows 90% of U.S. illicit fentanyl arrives through legal ports of entry, not uncontrolled border regions. Canada accounts for less than 2% of seizures, undermining claims about its central role in the crisis. Similarly, linking Mexican manufacturing imports to migration overlooks that 68% of recent border crossers come from Venezuela, Haiti, and Ecuador, countries unaffected by the tariffs. Legal challenges loom large. Canada's WTO complaint argues the tariffs violate Article 21 of GATT, which allows security exceptions only for essential security interests during war or emergency. With no armed conflict existing, a favorable WTO ruling could authorize $30 billion in annual retaliatory measures against the U.S. Separately, U.S. automakers are preparing lawsuits under the Fifth Amendment's Takings Clause, claiming arbitrary tariff imposition constitutes unlawful seizure of property. Diplomatic fallout. The tariffs have fractured the USMCA framework, painstakingly negotiated in 2020. Mexico's President Sheinbaum has accelerated talks with the EU-Mercosur trade bloc, while Canada is fast-tracking CPTPP ratification to diversify exports. These moves threaten to reduce U.S. export markets by $95 billion annually. Perhaps more damaging is the erosion of intelligence sharing mechanisms. Canadian officials hint at restricting NORAD data flows, while Mexico's cooperation on cartel investigations has cooled. Pathways to de-escalation. Several pragmatic solutions exist, though political will remains uncertain. Sectoral exemptions. Creating carve-outs for integrated industries like semiconductors, 75% North American cross-border trade, could preserve critical supply chains while allowing face-saving measures. Revenue recycling, directing tariff proceeds, estimated at $85 billion annually, to border security upgrades might align stated goals with fiscal policy. Sunset clauses, implementing automatic tariff reductions tied to verifiable decreases in drug seizures, migration flows could create off-ramps. Tripartite task force, a joint counter-narcotics initiative combining U.S. DEA resources, Canadian pharmaceutical oversight, and Mexican military intelligence would directly address stated tariff justifications. Historical precedents suggest compromise is possible. The 2018 USMCA renegotiation required 14 months, but ultimately preserved $1.3 trillion in trilateral trade. However, the current conflict's ideological framing as an invasion of migrants and drugs complicates back-channel diplomacy. Canada's ambassador, Kirsten Hillman, has privately likened the situation to using a flamethrower to kill a housefly, reflecting bureaucratic frustration. Corporate adaptation strategies. Multinationals are already executing contingency plans. Reshoring. Ford has allocated $2.2 billion to relocate engine production from Windsor, Ontario to Ohio currency hedging. Walmart's $23 billion Mexican subsidiary purchased $1.4 billion in Forex derivatives to offset peso volatility stockpiling. General Electric has tripled Canadian titanium sponge inventories to 18-month supply. Smaller enterprises face existential threats. A survey by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business found 38% of members lack capital to absorb tariff costs, risking 200,000 closures. Similar distress echoes through Mexico's 4.9 million SMEs, which account for 72% of employment. The inflation politics nexus. With U.S. midterm elections approaching, tariff impacts on consumer prices create electoral risks. States pivotal to Trump's 2024 victory show particular vulnerability. Pennsylvania, 14% projected increase in steel product costs threatens 18,000 construction jobs. Wisconsin, dairy tariffs could bankrupt 400 farms supplying Kraft Heinz, Arizona. Mexican produce tariffs may spike grocery bills by $1,200 annually per household. Democratic leaders plan to weaponize these pain points, with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer drafting a tariff relief act to nullify the measures. However, legislative success requires 67 Senate votes, a high bar given partisan divides. Long-term strategic shifts, even temporary tariffs, could catalyze permanent realignments. Mexico's nearshoring boom, $45 billion in new factories since 2021, now faces uncertainty, with 14% of firms reconsidering U.S.-focused investments. Canada's accelerated LNG exports to Europe, up 300% since 2022, may become permanent, reducing energy interdependence with the U.S. Perhaps most consequentially, China has offered both nations tariff-free access to its $1.4 billion consumer market through renegotiated CPTPP terms, a move that could redraw global trade maps. The human dimension beyond macroeconomic metrics, individual stories illustrate the crisis. In Detroit, auto worker Luis Garcia fears layoffs as his plant depends on Canadian transmissions. We finally recovered from COVID, now this? Meanwhile, Toronto grocer Amina Ali faces 28% cost hikes on California grapes, forcing agonizing price decisions. These micro-level impacts aggregate into societal strain. U.S. credit card debt has spiked $45 billion since February as households buffer rising costs. Expert consensus versus political reality. The economic community overwhelmingly condemns the tariffs. A survey of 150 economists found 94% predict net negative U.S. impacts, with Nobel laureate Paul Krugman calling them a textbook case of self-inflicted wounds. However, the administration dismisses such criticism, with Commerce Secretary Robert Lighthizer asserting, sometimes short-term pain births long-term sovereignty. This ideological rift complicates evidence-based resolution. The U.S.-Canada-Mexico tariff war represents a crisis of both economics and epistemology, a clash between data-driven policymaking and populist conviction. While retaliatory measures have indeed created pressure points, true American pushback remains embryonic, constrained by electoral calculations and bureaucratic inertia. The path forward demands multilateral creativity, perhaps through hybrid solutions that address legitimate security concerns without sacrificing integrated prosperity. As supply chain tremors intensify, all three nations confront a shared reality. In globalized economics, there are no unilateral solutions, only varying degrees of mutual destruction. The coming months will test whether political leadership can evolve faster than economic damage accumulates.